time for the Law and You segment, sponsored by Gig and Jancola. Join with us now. We've got the lawyers from the practice, Michael Gig, Christopher Jancola. Good morning, guys.
Morning. Good morning.
Yes. Talk about the types of law that both of you specialize in at your practice.
All right. Mike does our wills, trust, estates, and real estate, and I do our personal injury, workers' compensation, and Social Security disability.
Yes, and every week you answer questions that are submitted here anonymously on the show. Mike, we've got one for you this morning. It says, who should I name as executor of my estate?
Yeah, so simple question, kind of complicated answer. So typically if people have children, you know, they'll come in and they'll assume it should be their children, which is mostly the case. But then they say, their typical thing is, well, I'm going to name this child because they live closer, okay? And maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was maybe a legitimate reason because of, you know, things in the mail and things like that. But nowadays, you can get people sworn in. I've had people sworn in as executor from California, from Arizona, from all over the country. I mean, you can do things remotely. What I always tell people is the biggest and most important thing, because I've had to file petitions with the court to have people removed as executor for estates I'm not handling, is somebody that you trust, particularly with money. And the typical thing you see is the executor will take certain money for themselves. I've dealt with numerous cases like that. So it has to be somebody you trust, even if that child that you trust the most or family member that you trust the most lives across the country or you know, not very close. Because, you know, there is a lot of responsibilities depending on the estate, depending on how many assets there are, how complicated the assets are, but it has to be somebody you trust. And a lot of people wonder, what do they do? Well, the executor, they're the representative for the estate. So they are the ones who have to reach out to all the different financial companies, all the different, you know, creditors, things like that. It can be a lot of work. There's a lot of unique circumstances of how extent the work is, but it can be a lot of work, and your biggest responsibility is ultimately to get the assets to who they're supposed to go to according to the will. But beyond that, you have to make sure that all the debts are paid. You have to make sure that, you know, a big one is keeping up with if there's a mortgage on property, if there are certain, I've had code violations, you know, with maybe the city of Altoona, dealing with that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of things that are entailed with it. And the biggest thing is who's the most responsible, who's the most trustful. It doesn't matter where they reside.
Because even if something does go wrong, they are liable?
Well, that's another question. Some people, a lot of people bring up the fact that I don't, you know, can I renounce or not do because I don't want to be liable for anything.
Right.
Well, the only way you could potentially be liable is if, I mean, obviously, you know, steal money, something like that. Or the big one is if there are debts out there to be paid, and for some reason or another, maybe you don't make the attorney aware of it or they're not paid, those creditors can come back after the executor and make them personally liable for it. But I also tell the clients, listen, if there's money or assets to pay the debts, you have to pay them, regardless if that makes the estate insolvent or not. You know, that's the biggest thing, is where people can run into trouble is not all the debts are paid, or they say, well, we don't have to pay this because they'll never come after us, or, you know, that's where an executor could be personally liable, as long as, you know, all the debts are paid, assets go to who they're supposed to go to according to the will. There is no personal liability, but it's a lot of work. It can be a lot of work. And so you want to have somebody that's the most responsible, even if sometimes, I have that happen a lot, is somebody names somebody the executor because they want all the assets to go to like family members, but none of those family members they trust to be the executor, so they name someone totally different to be the executor. That happens too. Because I tell them, listen, they're the ones who are going to be dealing with this the entire time. That's who you want, even if it's somebody that's not going to get anything from the estate. They can always take an executor's fee. I always tell people that. So they get paid for their work. But somebody you trust, because if it's not, you run into so many problems, and it just causes a bunch of problems.
Better just to be impartial. right? I
Yes.
would think. Because then it kind of blurs the line. What if they're also a beneficiary and
Yeah.
they kind of feel entitled because
Well,
they're
but-
handling these things?
And as you can imagine, family dynamics come into play a lot.
Right.
And people have to try and, especially the executor, they have to take off the hat of being a brother or sister or a beneficiary. And you know, your first hat that you have to wear is executor, and you have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure everything's done correctly. So again, most responsible, most trustworthy.
So it's not just kids that, "Hey, he got more than me,"
Yeah.
right? That's what you have to deal with.
Yeah, there's a lot, and you have to be able to, as the executor, which they work with the attorney, but you have to be able to try to rise above that stuff and do what's best for the estate. But that can be tricky sometimes.
Can your attorney be your executor?
You can. I tell clients sometimes say, well, then can you just be it? And
Right.
most times I say no. One, I feel it's a conflict of interest. I don't
Sure.
believe being the estate attorney and the executor is proper, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And also just not having the time to
Right.
do it.
Yeah.
I've done it in a very, very, very limited circumstances where somebody maybe doesn't have much family, or they just simply don't have anybody they would trust to do it.
Yeah.
I steer away from it because I believe there could be a conflict of interest, and more importantly, just don't have the time to dedicate to it.
Yeah, obviously if someone's getting paid separately just to do that,
Yeah.
I mean, it
Yes.
is its own job in its own right. Well, and if people want to reach out to your practice, obviously this is leading into a whole different conversation. There's so many ways you can take this and ways of thinking. What's the best way to reach out to your practice?
Yes, please give us a call at 814-946-1606 or go to gig-law.com.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.